Hi there. In this video, we want to see how we can use the DKVf toolset to run clusters of servers implemented by DKVf and run YCSB experiments on our cluster. So we want to focus on eventual consistency. So I have cloned the repository in my local machine. So now I go ahead and first create my server side and then create the client side. So to create the server side, I first create an Eclipse project. I call it eventual server. Okay. And then I copy the content of the source directory of the DKVf core to my source directory here. And then I also copy the source files of the server side of the eventual consistency. So now I have all source files that I needed to implement to create my server side. So what I need to do is also add the libraries that are needed. So I copy the lib folder to my server side as well, and then add them to my project. Okay, so now my server side is ready. So what I want to do is first I compile and then create a jar file that include all of these files. So I go to export, and then I create a runnable jar file. So I create my jar file in the tool folder because I want to use tools in this folder. Call it eventual server.jar. Okay, so this is the server side of my eventually consistent key value store. Okay, now I want to create the client side of my key value store. So similarly, I create an Eclipse project. I call it eventual client, and similarly I copy the content of the DKVf core source directory to my source directory, and also the content of the source directory of the client side to my source directory. So everything is here, and now I copy the libs that I need, add them to my project, close. Okay, so now the client side is ready, so I create a jar file and it includes my eventual client, and call it eventual client.jar file and create it in the same folder here. Alright, so that's the server side and client side part. So now I want to go ahead and use the cluster designer and cluster manager to run cluster and run my experiments. Okay, now let's see how we can describe a cluster using the cluster designer. So first I add a server. So what I want to do is I want to create a cluster that has only 2 servers, and both of them have the full copy of the data. So I don't have any partition. So I have only 2 replica. So I call my first server 0_0. I want to run both of them on my local machine. I give the local machine address. So now I give the jar file address of the server side. I want to use the server side of eventual consistency that I created, so I give it to this. I don't need to give the client client class name for this tutorial. So I need to provide the authentication to connect to this machine, my local machine. You can use username and password or use SSH key. I want to use username and password because I have created a special user for this tutorial. I call it DKVf user. I give the information of the authentication. And then the working directory specify in what directory we want to create database file for this server. So you need to have the folder ready. I have already created a folder called DKVf in my C drive. So what I'm going to do is I use this folder. So if your machine is Windows like mine, you need to use /seek drive and your drive, which is C in my case, and use your folder. If it's Linux, you can use like home, your username, and etc. So here I have Windows, so I use /. Remember to have the this slash at the beginning. Seek drive, C DKVF, and server 00. And the client port that I want to assign is 2000, 2001 for server, and 2002 for control port. You can assign any valid client port. You don't need to change these variables, but if you want to change the default values, you can. And after this, you need to specify the protocol specific parameters. So in my eventually consistent implementation, I have a couple protocol specific parameter, like number of data centers. So I go to protocol properties and then specify number of data centers. For example, is 2 here because I have 2 replica. DC ID for this server is 0, and the PID also is 0. Okay, this is completely depend on your implementation. And that's it. So this is all I need to specify for my server. So I want to create another server. So I duplicate and double click and then change this one to 10. Everything is the same unless I use another folder and of course another port because I want to run both of them on the same machine. So I use 3000, and also protocol specific because this is another DC, but the partition is still 0. So I want to connect these replicas so they can send update to each other. So I connect these two together. I give it a name, eventual cluster, and I save my file, save my cluster designer descriptor file here. I call it eventual DCD and save it here. Now I export the cluster descriptor file using the export cluster. So if you come here, you see that the cluster designer have created an XML file for me. The XML file specify my cluster. So I have the server block, a couple servers. I have 2 servers, all the specification for the servers, and then how they are connected to each other. Okay, so this is the cluster side. So now let's go ahead and run this cluster on my local machine. So to run this cluster, we need to use another tool which is called Cluster Manager. So I have opened the command prompt, and I have and I'm in this folder. So I run my Java Cluster Manager jar file. So first I load the cluster descriptor file, which is eventual cluster.xml, and then I upload the cluster. So using upload underline cluster command, I can create the working directories and upload any necessary files to my hosts. So now in my DKVf folder, the cluster manager have created 2 folders, server 00 and server 10, that are for my servers. Now using a start cluster command, I can run my cluster. Okay, so now using cluster status command, I can see if my cluster is running well. So you can see that I have 2 servers, 00 and 10. They are both in the local machine. RTT is this, and server, they are supposed to connect it to one server, and they have been connected successfully, and no client is connected to these servers. So this is the running cluster. Now the cluster is ready now, and you can interact with the servers. Now let's go and see how we can run YCSB experiment on our cluster. So first we need to describe our experiment. To do that, I add a client. I call it client 0. I want to use the same local machine for the client. So I specify the client jar file to be my client, my eventual client jar file. So I need to specify the client class name with the full package address. So my eventual client package is this edumsu. And I specify eventual client, the class name. Username, again I use the same machine. So the workload, specify the YCSB files that I want to use for my workload. I have a properties.txt, but you can use any workload. So the workload specify what is the parameter for your YCSB experiment. For example, what is the read proportion, what is update and insert, and things like this. So I have, for example, specified a read proportion to 50% read and 50% insert. So I specify properties.txt. I don't need to set YCSB driver. So the working directory, zip drive, C, DKVf, client 0. OS is Windows. I don't need to change. So I go to and change the protocol specific. So for protocol specific, I have number of partitions for the client side. So number of partition is 1. and the DC ID, because clients are sticky in this implementation, so it will be data center 0. And that's it. This is what I need to specify for this client. And now I duplicate, create another client for this server. I call it client 1. I change the working directory for this and also the DC ID for this client, and then connect it to this. And now I use eventual exp or for experiment, and then I export experiment. So now I have an XML file that specifies my YCSB experiment. I have 2 clients, 1 client here and 1 client here. All the specifications are specified for, all the parameters are specified for these clients, and I'm ready to go to run the experiment. To run my experiment, I need to go to cluster manager again. This time I load experiment instead of cluster, and I give the eventual exp.xml file that cluster designer created for me. So I do if.exp.xml. Now I upload my experiment. I use option all to upload all files that I needed. So now you can see that it has created 2 additional folder for the client. And then now I start the experiment. Oh, so I need to specify the time in millisecond between a different variation of an experiment. To know more about this, you can go and read the wiki documentation on the GitHub. So I give just 20 milliseconds. And wait to run the YCSB experiments. Right, so what happens now is that it run the experiment and I got all of the results. So the result will be in the result folder here. You can see these are the YCSB result files. So cluster manager also help you to parse this result. So you can just say write parse results, and then there are a minimal command line query language that you can run to parse. You can go to the wiki to read more, but a simple things is a read aggregate result that aggregate all of the results for you, and then it put the result here in the generated here in the experimental results. So it creates a CSV file that include all of the results for throughput and latency. You can change this by, instead of some of the throughput or average latency, you can change this to maximum, minimum, other things. You can read the documents for this, but this is the result. So you can see what is the throughput and what is the latency for this YC experiment on my implementation.